The world outside the window was painted in shades of winter gray. As Emily stood in the living room of their home, watching the last remnants of sunlight slip beneath the horizon, the quiet of the evening seemed to settle over the house like a heavy blanket. Christmas was approaching, but this year the holiday felt different. Her husband, Nathan, had been away for days on a business trip, leaving her to handle the preparations on her own. Normally, she would have felt more than capable of managing everything. She had always taken pride in her independence and ability to take care of things. But this year, there was a strange, unfamiliar weight pressing on her, a tension she couldn't shake. The house was still and peaceful. It was a feeling that Emily usually cherished, the calm before the storm of the holiday rush. She had decorated the house earlier that day, a tradition she had grown accustomed to. The scent of pine from the tree filled the air, and twinkling lights cast a warm glow over the furniture. She smiled at the sight of the stockings hung by the fireplace, the familiar decorations that had been part of her Christmases for years. Yet, as she stood there, something felt slightly off. It wasn't that anything had gone wrong, it was just the absence of Nathan's presence. Without him, the house felt emptier, the warmth of the season a little more distant. Emily had grown accustomed to these quiet moments. Her life with Nathan had been comfortable, predictable, and steady. They had been married for 6 years, and though they had faced their share of challenges, they had always navigated them together. Nathan's business trips were a regular part of their life. He was an accountant, and his work often took him to different cities, leaving Emily to handle the house and the animals. Their small farm was a sanctuary for them both, a place where they could escape the chaos of the world and focus on what mattered, their life together. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Nathan wouldn't be home for a couple of days yet. She had heard his voice earlier that morning when they spoke on the phone. He sounded exhausted but eager to return home. His words were comforting, but they also reminded Emily of just how alone she felt at that moment. She had always enjoyed the peace and quiet when Nathan was away, but now, with the holiday season upon her, the absence felt louder than ever. Deciding to occupy herself, Emily slipped on her boots and coat and headed toward the barn. The cold air hit her face as soon as she stepped outside, sharp and biting, but she didn't mind. It was invigorating. The barn, like the house, felt familiar and reassuring. She had always loved spending time with the animals. The soft nicker of the horses and the gentle clucks of the chickens brought her a sense of calm that she rarely found anywhere else. Charlie, her horse, was waiting for her, his dark brown coat gleaming in the soft light of the barn. He was a steady companion, a horse she had raised since he was just a colt. Over the years, they had developed a bond that was stronger than any she had ever experienced with another animal. Charlie had always been a quiet, dependable horse, his calm demeanor a perfect match for Emily's own. She smiled as she approached him, reaching out to stroke his neck. "Hey, boy," she whispered, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather. Charlie snorted softly and nuzzled her hand, his warm breath mingling with the cold air. Emily laughed softly and pulled the brush from her pocket, ready to give him a good grooming. This was one of her favorite rituals, the quiet moments spent with him, brushing through his thick coat and listening to the sound of his contented sighs. But as she began brushing him, something felt strange. Charlie was still yes, but there was an unease about him that Emily couldn't place. His ears flicked back and forth nervously, and his body was tense, not in the usual way when he was anticipating something, but in a way that made Emily feel uneasy. She paused, brushing him gently, but the unease only grew. His usual calm, almost stoic nature seemed to be missing. "Charlie," Emily asked softly, her voice laced with concern. She took a step back, surveying the horse. His eyes were wide, his nostrils flared as though he were sensing something that she couldn't. The silence in the barn seemed to stretch out, growing thicker. Emily felt a ripple of anxiety that she couldn't shake. She had known this horse for years. There was no reason for him to be acting like this. She tried to calm herself, attributing it to the strange atmosphere of the holiday season. Maybe she was just overthinking things. Nathan's absence was playing tricks on her mind, making everything feel off-kilter. But as the minutes passed, Emily couldn't ignore the increasing tension in the air. Charlie was fidgeting now, pawing at the ground and tossing his head in a way that was unusual for him. She'd seen him do this before, but only when he was agitated or scared. It was like he was waiting for something, as though something was about to happen. She reached out again to soothe him, but this time, Charlie backed away, his eyes wide with something that resembled panic. It was as if he didn't recognize her. Emily's heart started to race. What was happening? She had never seen him act like this before. The barn door creaked suddenly, as though a gust of wind had pushed it. Emily froze, glancing around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual stillness of the farm at dusk. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and for a brief moment she felt like she was being watched. Charlie whinnied loudly, his body trembling now. Emily took a cautious step back, her breath shallow. What was causing this behavior? She had dealt with horses all her life, but this felt different, almost like Charlie was reacting to something beyond her understanding. Her thoughts raced, but just as quickly as the tension had built, Charlie suddenly calmed. The frantic energy left his body in a single exhale, and he turned his head to look at her, his expression softening as if nothing had happened. Emily's heart was still pounding in her chest, but she slowly relaxed as she stepped forward once again. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Charlie nickered softly, and for a moment everything seemed normal again. But even as she resumed brushing him, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. It was as if the calm before the storm had only been an illusion, a moment of false peace before the inevitable change. What had caused Charlie's sudden agitation? Was it just the stress of the season, or was something more at play? Whatever it was, she couldn't help but feel that this Christmas Eve would be unlike any other. The wind howled outside, sending a chill through the cracks of the old farmhouse. Inside, Emily stood near the barn door, her breath fogging in the cold air as she observed her horse, Charlie. It was strange. For years, the animal had been a model of calm and steadiness, a creature who seemed to take comfort in the rhythm of their daily routine. But tonight, something was wrong. The farm had always been a quiet refuge, far away from the bustle of the outside world. The low hum of the fridge, the sound of the wind against the wooden walls, the occasional creak of the floorboards, these had always been the familiar sounds of Emily's life. But that night, every creak, every rustle felt amplified. She glanced nervously at Charlie, who stood in the far corner of the barn, his eyes wide and his body tense, almost as if he were sensing something she couldn't. Emily had spent the better part of the day preparing for Christmas Eve, despite Nathan's absence. There was always a certain serenity to the holidays, a sense of order that she could rely on. Yet this year felt different. The quiet had turned oppressive. As she moved toward the horse, her boots clicking softly on the barn's floor, the uneasy feeling in her stomach only deepened. Something about the air felt wrong, thick with the weight of something unspoken, something coming. Charlie's sudden jump broke her from her thoughts. His ears shot back, his muscles tensing. Emily froze in her tracks. This wasn't like him. Even when startled by something unexpected, he usually recovered quickly. But tonight he was rigid, his nostrils flaring as he pawed nervously at the ground. The strange, erratic behavior continued, and Emily felt her own pulse quicken. Hey, she murmured, moving toward him slowly. "It's okay, Charlie. Calm down." But the horse didn't calm. Instead, he jerked his head sharply, glancing over his shoulder toward the barn door. Emily's eyes followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet shadow stretching long across the barn floor. The cold air outside had picked up, a sign of a storm rolling in, but it didn't feel like just a storm that was making Charlie so uneasy. Her instincts told her to step back. Something was wrong, and her mind was telling her not to push it. She didn't know what it was, but she had learned over the years to trust her gut. Charlie had always been sensitive to shifts in the environment, storms, changes in the weather, even shifts in the earth, but tonight was different. There was no storm yet, no change in the environment that could explain his erratic behavior. It was as though he were reacting to something unseen. Emily took another step closer, this time cautiously, as if testing the waters. "Come here, boy," she cooed softly, trying to reassure him. But Charlie didn't respond. His body had stiffened, his eyes darting in a way that made Emily's heart skip a beat. And then, as if in slow motion, Charlie suddenly bolted forward, smashing into the barn door with such force that Emily stumbled backward. She gasped, nearly falling, her hands shooting out to grab the edge of the haystack for balance. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen him do. He was always the most docile of creatures, and here he was, panicked, wild. The sheer power of his movement rattled her. "What on earth?" she whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. It took a moment before she was able to regain her footing. Charlie, for his part, was pawing at the door, his hooves scraping violently against the wood, eyes wide and ears flat. He was trapped in some kind of frenzy. It was as though something was drawing him toward that door, something he couldn't escape. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she quickly assessed the situation. She knew there was no way Charlie could have gotten spooked by something outside the barn was securely locked, and there hadn't been any strange noises that might have alarmed him. No strange cars pulling up, no strange animals or intruders. Yet, something had clearly unsettled him. She stepped forward again, this time with more caution. She had to calm him down or risk him injuring himself. "Charlie," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "What's wrong, boy?" The horse let out a low, distressed whinny and tossed his head again. The barn door, creaking under the pressure of his frantic behavior, seemed to be shaking in response. The atmosphere felt heavy, the very air charged with something Emily couldn't quite name. She reached out a hand to touch him, but Charlie jerked away violently, nearly knocking her off balance. "Hey," she cried out, panic beginning to rise in her chest. "Charlie, stop." She could feel the tension in her own body now, every muscle on edge. She had never seen him behave this way, and the uncertainty in the air only added to the strangeness of the situation. What could be causing this? The feeling of unease that had been building all evening was now overwhelming, and she couldn't shake the sense that something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of her understanding. Charlie's panicked behavior reached a new level as he suddenly stopped in his tracks, his head low and his body rigid. His ears flicked back, and his nostrils flared wide. For a moment he was still, as though listening, waiting. Then, with one swift movement, he bolted again, this time toward the far side of the barn, his hooves pounding against the dirt floor. Emily's heart raced. What was happening? She had no idea. She had seen horses spooked by storms, by noises, by the presence of strangers, but this felt different. Charlie wasn't just frightened, he was reacting to something unseen, something beyond her comprehension. She hesitated for a moment, watching him pace nervously in a circle, his eyes darting about as if something invisible was circling him, pressing in. She felt the tension building around her, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Her stomach twisted as the sudden fear gnawed at her insides. Something wasn't right. But what could it be? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the barn door creaked open just a little, a gust of icy air pushing through the crack. Emily froze. That wasn't possible. She had checked the door earlier, and it had been secure. The wind shouldn't have been able to move it like that. She glanced toward Charlie, who was now standing still, his head raised high, his entire body alert and tense. He was staring at the door, his ears flicking back and forth, watching it with an intensity that made Emily's blood run cold. For a long moment she stood there, her heart thudding in her chest, waiting for something to happen. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step toward the door. It seemed as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the cold wood of the door. But as soon as her fingers made contact, a cold wind swept through the barn, sending a chill down her spine. Emily drew her hand back quickly, her eyes wide as she scanned the space around her. She could feel it now. Something was in the barn with her, something she couldn't see, but could feel in every fiber of her being. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but some force was holding her in place. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to believe it. But the strange, unsettling behavior of Charlie, the way the barn door had moved, and the oppressive atmosphere in the air all pointed to one thing: something was terribly wrong. Something had come into their world, and it was now waiting. The storm had been building for hours, but it wasn't the wind or the rain that had Emily on edge. It was the strange, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to settle over the barn, heavy with something she couldn't quite place. The air was thick, charged, and as if it were pressing against her from all sides. Charlie, her usually calm and docile horse, had been acting increasingly erratic, pacing back and forth, his eyes wide with something resembling fear. Every time Emily tried to calm him, he recoiled, his body stiff with tension, his ears flattened to the sides of his head. She stood frozen in the center of the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. Something wasn't right, she knew it, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. Charlie had always been a steady companion, never given to fits of anxiety or sudden outbursts. But tonight was different. Tonight, the horse seemed to be trapped in some kind of frenzy that Emily couldn't understand. His usual calmness had been replaced by a nervous energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She glanced toward the barn door again. It had been closed earlier, locked tightly as she always did. Yet now it was ajar, the wooden planks groaning with the occasional gust of wind that slipped through the crack. Emily's pulse quickened, and she moved cautiously toward the door, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth of the barn floor with each step. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, was overwhelming. Every part of her screamed to turn around, to leave the barn and never look back, but her legs wouldn't move. She had to know what was happening. As she reached for the door, the barn fell eerily silent. Even the wind outside had died down, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. Emily could hear her own heartbeat, a loud thudding in her ears. Her fingers brushed the cold wood of the door, and she felt a strange jolt of electricity run through her, as if the very air around her had shifted, pulsating with an unseen force. She yanked her hand back, staring at the crack in the door, her eyes wide with disbelief. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, but something far more unsettling, an energy vibrating from deep within the earth, or perhaps from something even farther beyond. Charlie let out a loud, high-pitched whinny that echoed through the barn, his body jerking violently. In that moment, the barn seemed to warp, the walls shifting as if the very structure of reality was starting to unravel. Emily stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind raced to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logical explanation. The barn had always been a place of safety for her, a place where she could forget the outside world. But now it felt like a trap, a cage closing in around her. Before she could react, a low growl reverberated from the far side of the barn, sending a chill down her spine. It was a sound she had never heard before, deep and guttural, like something not quite animal. The growl turned into a hiss, a sharp, rasping sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Charlie's panicked movements grew more erratic, and he slammed his body into the barn door, as though trying to escape whatever was coming. Emily could feel it now, something moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong. She instinctively moved closer to Charlie, who was no longer acting like the gentle animal she had known for so long. His eyes, wide and frantic, were now fixed on something in the corner of the barn, something that Emily couldn't see but could feel. The air had thickened again, dense with an energy that seemed almost alive, pulsing and throbbing in time with the increasing pressure in her chest. And then, the unthinkable happened. The barn door slammed open with such force that it seemed to shake the entire structure. A gust of cold wind rushed in, swirling the hay on the floor and making the shadows dance along the walls. For a moment, Emily was blinded by the brightness of the moonlight that spilled through the open doorway, casting long, sharp beams into the dark interior. And in the midst of that light, she saw it. A figure tall and vaguely humanoid, though its proportions were off, strange and elongated. Its skin was an unnatural shade of pale gray, almost translucent, and it shimmered like the surface of water disturbed by wind. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto Emily's. The sensation of being watched, of being targeted, was immediate and overpowering. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had seen something like this before, but only in the stories her grandmother used to tell her, the old folklore, the warnings about creatures that came from beyond the stars. But this was not a story. It was real. The figure took a step forward, and as it moved, Emily felt the temperature of the air drop, the warmth of her breath freezing in the air. She glanced at Charlie, who stood still, his body tense and his eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't the one she needed to worry about now. The creature was closing in. Before Emily could react, the figure raised its hand, a long, thin appendage that ended in 3 clawed fingers. She felt a surge of heat rush through her, her heart pounding in her chest, as if something inside her were waking up, stirring from a deep, forgotten place. The creature's eyes flickered, and Emily felt herself drawn toward it, as if an invisible force was pulling her toward the unknown. "Stay away," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. She had no idea what she was facing, but she knew it was something beyond her understanding, something that didn't belong here. But the creature didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to bend the air itself, distorting the space around it like a mirage. The pressure in the room grew unbearable and Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing for an escape. There was no way out, no way to outrun whatever this thing was. She could feel her legs weakening, her body shutting down in the face of an unimaginable force. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, like it was no longer solid, no longer real. And then, just as the figure reached out for her, the unthinkable happened. Charlie, the horse she had known and loved for years, let out a deafening scream. It was not a sound she had ever heard from him before. It was wild, primal, a sound of pure terror. Without warning, he charged toward the creature, his hooves pounding against the barn floor with an intensity she had never seen. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she watched the horse collide with the figure, his powerful body smashing into it with enough force to shake the barn. But the creature didn't recoil. Instead, it absorbed the impact, its body shifting and warping around Charlie's attack as if it were made of liquid, bending and flowing like a stream. The horse reared back, his eyes wide with shock, and Emily could see the panic in his movements. He couldn't fight it. In that moment, something deep inside Emily snapped. She wasn't going to let this thing take Charlie. Not now, not after everything they had been through together. She had to act, had to fight back. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the wall and rushed toward the creature. She didn't know what she was doing, didn't know how she thought a simple tool could help, but she couldn't stand there and do nothing. She shouted, brandishing the pitchfork with trembling hands, and aimed it at the creature's glowing eyes. For a split second, the creature hesitated, its eyes flickering with something almost like recognition. But it was too late. Emily lunged forward, the pitchfork stabbing toward its chest. And in that moment, everything went black. The world seemed to collapse in on itself, the air thick with the sense of impending destruction. The barn groaned as if it were alive, and the ground beneath them trembled with a power that could not be controlled. The unthinkable had happened, and now there was no going back. The aftermath of the fall was something that neither Emily nor Charlie could have prepared for. It was as if everything they had known had been swept away in an instant, leaving them adrift in an unknown void, where the rules of reality no longer applied. The barn, once a place of comfort and safety, was now a foreign and alien environment, its walls bending in strange angles, its floor shifting beneath their feet. The creature, the thing that had seemed so impossibly out of place, so otherworldly, was no longer there, but the remnants of its presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Emily lay on the cold, hard floor, her body aching from the impact. Her mind swirled with confusion, trying to piece together what had just happened. She had felt the pressure of the creature's gaze, the heat of its touch, and then darkness. The world had dissolved around her like sand slipping through the fingers of a clenched fist. But now she was awake. The air was thick with something she couldn't explain, and the barn around her seemed to hum, alive with a strange energy. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The chaotic noise of the barn, the wind, the creaking of the wooden beams, the frantic movement of Charlie had all stopped. It was as if everything had frozen, suspended in time. The usual hum of the world had vanished, leaving behind an eerie stillness that settled in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She could hear her own pulse, a steady thud against her ribs, but there was no other sound. No wind, no animals, no sign of the outside world at all. With great effort, she pushed herself up from the floor. Her head spun, and for a moment she felt as if she might collapse again. The pitchfork she had grabbed earlier was still in her hand, though it seemed oddly out of place now, as if it belonged to a different time, a different world. She could barely remember why she had grabbed it or what she had been planning to do with it. Charlie was standing a few feet away, his body trembling with nervous energy. He was looking at her, his eyes wide with confusion, his ears twitching nervously. For a moment, Emily thought she saw something strange in his gaze, something not quite right. But then the moment passed, and she dismissed it as a trick of her mind. She stood slowly, testing her balance. The floor beneath her seemed unsteady, as though the barn itself was no longer tethered to the ground, its foundations shifting like liquid. She staggered toward Charlie, reaching out to steady herself against his side. His warmth was a comfort, but it didn't entirely ease the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. The barn, she realized, was different. The familiar smells of hay, wood, and the faint musk of animals were gone, replaced by something foreign, something metallic and unnatural. The walls seemed to pulse, their once sturdy beams now twisting and bending as if they were made of rubber. The shadows in the corners of the barn moved unnaturally, stretching and bending in ways that defied reason. Even the air itself felt thick, laden with an energy she couldn't explain. Charlie shifted uneasily beneath her hand, his hooves clopping softly against the floor. Emily glanced down at him, and for the first time she noticed that his fur had changed. The once dark brown coat was now mottled with strange, iridescent patterns, glimmering faintly in the dim light. His eyes, too, had changed, no longer the calm, trusting brown they had once been. They were now a pale, shimmering silver, almost too bright for her to look at directly. It was as if the creature had left its mark on him, an indelible imprint of its presence. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? What's going on?" But the horse didn't answer. Of course he couldn't. Still, there was something in his eyes that seemed to say he, too, didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand what had changed. It was as if the very fabric of their reality had been torn open, and they were left in the aftermath, trying to make sense of a world that no longer behaved as it should. Emily took a hesitant step toward the barn door, her eyes scanning the warped, shifting walls. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to see what lay outside, had to know if the world beyond the barn had been affected as well. Slowly she approached the door, her hand reaching out to push it open. As her fingers brushed the cold wood, the barn seemed to shudder, a low, almost imperceptible vibration running through the walls. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. A chill ran down Emily's spine and she pulled her hand back instinctively. But the door, already ajar, swung open of its own accord, as though guided by an unseen force. She stepped back, eyes wide, and looked out into the night. What she saw made her stomach lurch. The once familiar farmyard was gone. The fence, the trees, the distant hills, they were all gone, replaced by a barren, lifeless landscape that stretched out in every direction. The ground was cracked and dry, the earth scorched as if it had been burned by an intense, unnatural heat. The sky above was dark, devoid of stars, swirling with a sickly, greenish hue. It was as if the entire world had been infected, turned into something unrecognizable. The familiar had become the alien, and Emily felt a deep, primal fear rise in her chest. She couldn't understand it. How could this have happened? How could everything have changed so suddenly, so completely? But there was no time to process it. A sound broke the silence, soft at first, but growing louder. Emily turned to see Charlie, his head lifted high, his nostrils flaring. He was looking toward the horizon, his eyes wide with panic. She followed his gaze, her own heart racing. In the distance, a shape appeared on the horizon, moving quickly toward them. At first it looked like a blur, but as it drew closer, Emily could make out the outline of something large, something that seemed to hover just above the ground, shifting and pulsating with the same eerie energy that had filled the barn. It was coming toward her, faster than any vehicle could travel, faster than anything she had ever seen. Panic seized her chest as she realized it wasn't a natural thing. Whatever it was not of this world. Her thoughts raced, but her body froze. She could hear Charlie's hooves beating against the ground as he backed away, his body tense, his muscles coiled. Emily wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she couldn't move. The world had gone completely out of her control, and she had no idea how to fix it. The shape grew closer still, and Emily could see now that it was not a machine, not a vehicle, it was something living, something alive. But it wasn't human. She couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was unmistakably alien, its form constantly shifting and flickering as if it were made of liquid light. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting everything it touched. Emily's legs finally gave way, and she collapsed onto the ground, her hands trembling as she looked up at the sky. The stars were gone. The familiar constellations, the comforting pinpricks of light that had always been her guide in the night, had vanished. In their place was a vast, swirling void, black, endless, and full of an incomprehensible power. What had happened? What had she done to bring this upon herself, upon Charlie? She had no answers, only questions that seemed to echo into the abyss. And as the strange figure moved closer, Emily realized that there was no turning back. Whatever had begun that night, whatever strange force had been unleashed in the barn, was now taking over everything. The world they had known was gone. The future, uncertain and terrifying, had arrived. There would be no return to the way things had been. No return to the life she had once known. And in that moment, Emily knew whatever was coming next, she would face it with Charlie by her side. Whatever they had to endure, they would endure it together. Because there was no other choice. A moment of clarity is something that most people experience at least once in their lives, but rarely do they recognize it in the instant it happens. Often it's only later, in reflection, that we realize how truly profound a single moment can be, and how it shapes the course of everything that follows. For Emily, this was not a fleeting thought or a quiet epiphany. It was an awakening, sharp and unmistakable, a sudden eruption of understanding that fractured the suffocating chaos she had been caught in for what seemed like an eternity. It was in the middle of the night, just as the eerie hum of the alien presence outside seemed to thrum louder in the air, that Emily finally felt the weight of the change. The sky above was no longer the familiar blanket of stars. Instead, it pulsed with a dark, unsettling glow that seemed to sink into her very bones. The landscape that had once been her sanctuary was now a dystopian wasteland, an unrecognizable place where nothing seemed to have any connection to the world she once knew. But in the thick, dense fog of her confusion, when fear and uncertainty had pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, Emily stood in that barn, her barn, the one place she had always felt safe and felt the stirrings of something different. It wasn't the strangeness of the barn's warped walls or the unnatural energy in the air that struck her. It wasn't the strange alien figure approaching from the distance, or even the eerie transformation of Charlie's once familiar coat, now shimmering with iridescent colors. It wasn't the sense of dread in her chest that was slowly being replaced by a cold, gnawing terror. No, what struck Emily most was the realization that despite all of this, despite the impossible situation she found herself in, she still had control. In that moment, everything slowed. The pounding of her heart, the quickened breath in her lungs, the erratic movement of the world, it all stopped. For the first time since the creature had invaded her life, since the barn had shifted, since Charlie's transformation had begun, Emily understood. She understood that her world had been irrevocably changed, but that she still had the power to choose how she would face it. Her mind, which had been scrambling for answers, now settled into a rare, clear calmness. The chaos outside was real. There was no denying it, but there was something deeper, something more profound, that had to be faced. And that something was the truth. The truth that her life had been redefined in an instant, but that didn't mean it was over. It didn't mean she had lost. Charlie shifted nervously beside her, his hooves tapping softly on the warped floor. The shimmering glow of his coat still unsettled her, but now, instead of feeling helpless, she felt a strange bond with him. He wasn't just a horse anymore, he was something else, something powerful, something transformed, something that, like her, had been thrust into this new reality, this new world. His strange mutating form wasn't a burden or a threat, it was part of the evolution. They were both part of it. Her thoughts circled around this, swirling like the strange winds that now seemed to blow through the barn, making the walls bend and warp. She focused on Charlie's eyes, his silver gaze that had replaced his once warm brown eyes, and she realized that it wasn't fear in them that she saw. It was resolve. Whatever had happened to them, whatever this dark force was, it hadn't broken them. It had changed them, yes, but they weren't lost. Not yet. The distant hum of the alien presence grew louder, and Emily felt the ground beneath her shift. The barn's walls continued to sway, bending as if alive. Still, she stood tall, facing the world outside, and realized that she wasn't alone in her struggle. There was a connection between her and Charlie now, one that went beyond the simple relationship of a woman and her horse. This bond had deepened, evolved, and she could feel it in her bones. They weren't merely surviving anymore, they were adapting. They were becoming something more than human and animal. And as the figure in the distance drew closer, its pulsating light growing stronger, Emily's clarity intensified. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted from them, they would face it together. They would no longer be passive in their suffering. The unknown was a threat, but it was also an opportunity. They were not victims of fate, nor were they powerless. They had the strength to decide their future. For the first time in a long while, Emily's hands weren't trembling. Her heart wasn't racing with panic. She had a purpose now. She understood that, while the world had changed, it was still hers to navigate. She didn't know what this creature was or where it had come from, but she knew one thing: it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Charlie shifted beside her again, and for the first time she reached up to touch his shimmering coat. The texture beneath her fingers felt like nothing she had ever touched before, both alien and familiar, warm and electric. She didn't know what transformation had occurred within him, but she could feel it. Whatever power he had gained, whatever essence had altered his form, it was now her power too. Together they were stronger than they had ever been alone. Emily turned back toward the barn door, the landscape outside still strange and unwelcoming. But she didn't feel the same fear that had gripped her moments earlier. The unknown was still terrifying, but now she faced it with a new kind of resolve, one that came from within, from the understanding that she had a role to play in this. No matter what happened, she wasn't just a passive bystander. She was a participant in her own fate. In the distance, the alien shape continued to approach, moving with unsettling speed, its light flashing in pulses. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined. She wasn't going to wait for whatever it was to arrive at her door. She wasn't going to allow herself to be swept up in the chaos without understanding it first. For the first time since everything had changed, Emily knew what she had to do. She had to learn what was happening, and she had to find a way to fight it. Whatever this creature wanted, whatever force had twisted the world around her, she was no longer afraid of it. The barn trembled again, and the doors slammed open as if responding to the energy that surrounded them. Emily looked back at Charlie, her horse, her companion in this strange new world. Together they would face whatever was coming. The world outside was no longer the same. But for Emily, the clarity she had found in that moment was more powerful than anything else she had experienced. No longer lost in confusion, no longer swept away by fear, she was ready. She was ready to fight for her future. And so, together, Emily and Charlie stepped forward into the unknown. The new year had arrived, but it didn't feel like a typical beginning. The days leading up to the turn of the year had been filled with uncertainty, with moments of panic and bursts of realization that left Emily breathless. Everything she had known had been torn apart, reshaped, and put back together in ways that she couldn't yet fully understand. But as she stood at the threshold of the barn, with the cold winter wind biting at her cheeks and the glow of distant stars illuminating the strange landscape, there was a sense of peace in her heart. The turmoil of the past few months had not been easy, but in some strange way it had shaped her. It had made her stronger, more resolute, and more certain of what she needed to do. Emily had come to terms with the unimaginable, with the alien creature that had altered her world. It hadn't been an easy journey. There had been moments of despair, moments when she felt like giving up, when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. But somewhere along the way, a shift had occurred. She had learned to embrace the unknown, to understand that it wasn't something to be feared, but something to be explored. And now, with the new year stretching before her like an uncharted path, Emily knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. The days after the aliens' arrival were a blur of strange occurrences. The landscape outside had changed beyond recognition. What had once been familiar fields and rolling hills were now jagged, alien terrain that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. But within the barn, the place she had once felt was her sanctuary, there had been a profound transformation as well. It was no longer just a shelter from the outside world. It had become a symbol of her resilience, a place where she could regroup, heal, and plan her next steps. It had become the center of her new life. Charlie, her horse, had been her constant companion through this. At first, she had been afraid of him, afraid of the changes she had seen in his form, his once familiar shape now distorted, shimmering with strange colors, and his movements more fluid, more alien. But as the days passed, Emily had learned to trust him, to trust in the bond they shared. The deep connection between them had become something more than just human and animal. It had become a partnership, one where each of them understood the other in ways that were difficult to put into words. Together, they had faced the chaos of the past months, and together, they would face the challenges of the future. As the year turned, Emily stood in front of the barn, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was something new in the air now, something different from before. The oppressive weight that had hung over her for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet calm. The alien presence that had threatened her life, that had disrupted her world, had receded for now. There was no sign of it in the sky, no ominous glow on the horizon. It was as if, for a moment, the universe had given her a reprieve. But Emily knew better than to think that the danger was over. She had learned too much in the past few months to believe in simple resolutions. The alien presence wasn't gone, it was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And when it did, she would be ready. She had to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft nicker of Charlie, who had moved up beside her. She turned to face him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The wind, the strange landscape, the unsettling unknown, it all seemed distant as she looked into the horse's eyes. There was a quiet understanding between them, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. Emily reached out to touch his shimmering coat, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her fingertips. The transformation he had undergone was nothing short of miraculous, and yet, in his eyes, she saw nothing but loyalty and trust. He wasn't just a creature of change. He was a companion, a friend, and a partner in this strange new world they had found themselves in. The night sky above was clear, the stars twinkling in the distance like beacons of hope. The new year was upon them, and with it, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by fear or uncertainty. Emily knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be more challenges, more struggles, and more moments when she would feel lost. But she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had Charlie, and she had herself the strength that she had discovered within herself in the face of the unimaginable. The future, as uncertain as it was, now seemed filled with possibilities. Emily didn't know what it would hold. She didn't know whether the alien presence would return, or whether the world would settle into some new, unsettling normal. But she knew one thing for certain: she would face it head-on, with the same resolve that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life. She was no longer the same person she had been before the aliens arrived. She had been tested, transformed, and reborn in ways that she hadn't yet fully understood. But one thing was clear: she was stronger than she had ever been, and the future, no matter how uncertain, held the promise of something more. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill her lungs. It was the start of a new day. The start of a new year. The start of a new chapter in her life. She turned back to the barn, her mind already racing with possibilities. There was much to be done and much to learn, but for the first time in a long while she felt ready. With a final glance at the horizon, Emily smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and uncertain, but it was a smile nonetheless. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with strength, and with Charlie by her side. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Emily stepped forward into the new year, knowing that the journey ahead would be challenging, but that she was ready to take it on, whatever it may bring.